Hello, welcome to Football Geeks. My guest this evening is writer, author, and podcaster Aidan Williams, who features prominently as panelist on the excellent These Football Times podcast. His 2022 book, The Nearly Men, told the story of the greatest teams who promised yet failed to deliver World Cup glory to their respective nations. But his new book, Euro 1984, The Greatest Tournament You Never Saw, explores probably the finest tournament of them all. Criminally ignored by the British media and TV, but is celebrated in this fantastic new book. Aidan, hello.
Hi there, Phil. Really pleased to be on to talk about a fantastic tournament.
Mate, it was brilliant. But can I just say so about the book? I mean, I always say that decent books inform, but excellent books transport. And this book has got that transportive quality. I can almost feel the Gallic sunshine of 1984 burning my back. It's a cracking read, and I recommend it to anybody who's got a fleeting or a big interest in that tournament, because it's really wonderful, mate. Really wonderful.
Oh, thank you so much. It's definitely the imagery and the sort of the atmosphere around it is definitely part of the appeal, I think. You know, the crackly old sound coming through, and the sort of beautiful early evening sunset shadows across the pitch in these gloriously ramshackle old French stadiums. It's beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. And the I think we'll talk about it in a little bit, the qualification, but if some of the teams had sort of qualified that you would have expected to qualify, it wouldn't have been as beautiful, because you look at all the kits of the teams that there were 8 teams there. 6 wore Adidas kits, which we're wearing this evening as well, though, may I point out. And there were only 2 that weren't Adidas, but they all had that kind of that glimmer, didn't they? And they caught the sun, and they just look all the teams look magnificent. Whereas if England had turned up in their Umbro whites, it probably wouldn't have been the same sort of deal. Yeah.
So, especially since it's the Danish kit that was there instead of them, and that's a glorious kit as well. But the French one was perfection itself, also.
Absolutely, the chevrons. I love the chevrons. They were amazing. Aidan, talk us through the motivations for writing Euro 1984. You've touched on it, but what are the deeper seated feelings behind you writing about this tournament?
Yeah, there's a few things, I think. I mean, primarily, and I talk about this a bit at the start of the book, is that this tournament came when I ought to have been at a great age to absorb so much of it. I was summer of 1984. I was 9, nearly 10. So this would have been a terrific time. I remember the 1982 World Cup, of course, but equally I was quite young for that. And then 1986 World Cup, I remember in great detail because I was a little bit older. But this fell right between the two, and it should have been prime time for me as a child. And yet I feel like I was denied it. And this is probably the modern me thinks I was denied it. At the time, I was blissfully unaware. You know, we were celebrating things like John Barnes scoring in the Maracanã, which was happening at the same time, more or less, and celebrating things like that. And then I would have been too young to stay up for any late night highlights of this. I was aware of little snippets from the qualifying, certain key games, and I did watch the final round at a friend's house. I remember that distinctly. But I doubt that I ever really fully appreciated that that was the culmination of a few weeks of glorious tournament and not just a sort of one-off game like the European Cup final, for example. Yeah. I probably felt about it like I would do about that. So I feel like I totally missed out. The other part of it is obviously because it was so glorious. And I've had to learn about this tournament in retrospect rather than, say, 82 or 86 World Cups, where I remember my feelings and thoughts at the time a little bit. This one, I had no opportunity for that. So I've had to learn about it. But each bit you learn, like through all my teenage, adult life and whatever, to get to the point now where I write about it, it's bits that have been built on top of each other, and the story grows and you see more and more about it and realize what a fantastic tournament was. certain key games obviously lead into that the most, and I'm sure we'll get on to one of the most significant of those later on. But equally, the other aspect to it all is that you mentioned my previous book, The Nearly Men. Well, this French team are one that some have argued should be in that book. I'd left them out in part because their story had a victory in it. Okay, it wasn't a World Cup victory, but that team as a whole, they did climb the summit and they did win, and that sort of kind of excluded them. But I felt bad about it because I really enjoyed them and I really loved them. So that was another motivation for it. But I guess the main thing was just a celebration of, firstly, that team who played with such style and swagger, looked glorious and looked elegant and cool as they did it. You can forget what Platini may have become later in his career off the field, but on the field he was simply sublime. And the team he was the main aspect of was just absolutely fantastic. And this was their greatest moment. And it's very, very rare that a team who plays so idealistically, so beautifully, gloriously, actually wins the trophy. That is very rare, which is, of course, the key theme of the other book. And so when they actually do walk off with the trophy, I think that deserves extra celebration.
Definitely, mate. Definitely. I mean, we'll talk about the kind of later on the Magic Square and the fabulous players contained within that. It was an incredible tournament, but the prelude to it, especially the 4 years that kind of came before it, it wasn't in a good place, was it? The Euros leading into 1984. Can you talk to us specifically about the Euros prior to the 84 tournament?
Yeah, so this was the second 8-team tournament. So they'd shifted from it just being a 4-team final. So they'd usually been groups of qualifying, followed by home and away quarterfinals, and then just 4 teams playing in a final. So it was all done and dusted in a few days. 2 semi-finals and a final. And there were some good ones of those. You know, the Panenka penalty and moments like that stick in the memory very, very well. But they were more akin to what I was talking about earlier, for the sort of one-off occasions almost. So in 1980, they expanded this slightly, and this is going alongside World Cup expansion at the same time. The 82 World Cup was the first to go up to 24 teams, so it was kind of in parallel with what was happening there. But the 1980 European Championship was poor in so many ways. So it was in Italy. Firstly, it was very poorly attended, other than when the hosts were playing. Secondly, the football was pretty awful all around, other than when certain players in West Germany were on show. People like Bernd Schuster, for instance. He was probably by far the standout player of that tournament. But players like that, of his ilk, of his style, were few and far between. It was all a little more prosaic, a little more laboured. England were in there and didn't exactly cover themselves in glory on the field or off it either. There was all sorts of incidents, especially England-Belgium games, a famous one with tear gas sweeping across the pitch and chaos in the stands. That was almost symbolic or emblematic of a tournament on its knees, if you like. It was really poor fare. Ultimately, the right winner came through. West Germany did win it. They were the class act of the tournament and they beat Belgium in the final. It was a terrific outcome for Belgium. But across the board, it had been poor. The fact that it hadn't really captured the imagination across the continent, and I guess this was at a time where the European Championship was a long way behind the World Cup. It really was. They were trying to play catch-up in some ways. But they'd opted for a poor format as well. So they'd gone to 8 teams and 2 groups of 4. Okay, great. But what they'd done is copy the second stage groups from the previous World Cups, where 2 groups of 4, and only the winners then went straight through to the final. So they just lifted that straight out the second stage of the 74 and 78 World Cups. Now, that's a format that sometimes, yes, it can produce the right outcome, perhaps, but it doesn't leave much in it for everybody else. It lets the tournament die on its knees a little bit for some teams because they know they can't make it. One defeat and you're basically out. You're done for. So that harmed the tournament as well. And the runners-up just go straight to a meaningless third-place player home. What is the benefit of coming second in a group and ending straight in that? It was meaningless, even more meaningless as a playoff then, I think, than it is in World Cups today. So when it came to 1984, a lot had to change. And well, I guess it achieved on a whole number of measures. But really, the European Championship itself was in a bad state coming into 1984, and in effect needed rescuing, needed salvaging, and it's fair to say I think it achieved it, and it kind of came dragged into the modern age a little bit. 1980 had been half-hearted attempt at planning and no real marketing and no real pushing it across the continent. It just wasn't something that captured people's minds across the continent. But a lot of that would change by 1984.
Yeah, I think in 1980, the Italians didn't even want it, did they? They were holding out and expectant that they were going to get the 1982 World Cup. So there was a kind of blasé non-enjoyment of getting that tournament. And it was a kind of shadow that kind of transposed itself on all the play. It was so bleak and boring. I mean, that was my first European Championships. I'd watched the 1978 World Cup. That was when my football consciousness had started, and I was expecting something the same, and it just faded. It was a nothing of a tournament, really, apart from the two games featuring West Germany, which against Holland, and the final, which was a surprisingly good game. So we're moving on to 1984 now, and it was played in the blistering heat of France, and it was a kaleidoscope of brilliant colours and brilliant kits. But the prequel to the tournament itself, the qualifying process, it threw up a number of shocks, didn't it? And the 8 teams that arrived in France weren't the ones that anyone really expected. Would you talk us through some of those notable stories that arose during qualification, Aidan?
Yeah, and this was on part I really wanted to include in the book, because there are, the tournament, any tournament is more than just the finals, it's the qualifying too. But I think in modern times, we see the qualifiers as so big and bloated and a bit of a formality. In these days, it was anything but. So there were only 30 odd countries in Europe at the time. This was pre the breakup, of course, of Eastern Europe. So not that many countries competing. So the strength in depth was quite a lot. Equally, only 7 teams could qualify to join France. So we had 7 separate groups, and only the winners would go through. So naturally, there were going to be some tough ties for some people. I guess the biggest shock of all is that the world champions Italy, obviously the seeded team in their group, only won 1 match throughout the entire qualification process, and that was against Cyprus. They managed to finish behind Czechoslovakia and Sweden and the ultimate qualifiers Romania, who more or less had a 3-way battle for qualification. Italy were nowhere near, way out of it. I think they paid the price for the loyalty of the coach to the World Cup winners. I think he felt that he had to maintain a lot of the same squad. He had to sort of reward them if they hadn't willingly stepped aside. He wasn't going to push them when they were World Cup winners. But equally, I guess it's the ultimate hangover as well. How do you get yourself back up after such an unlikely success in many ways that theirs was in 1982? For the mundanity of qualifying and trying to see off teams that you should be better than, and they really should have been, but they were well beaten by a selection of well-organized teams. It's Romania that made it through, which was the emergence, I guess, of the green shoots, or the start of the generation that would come on to be strong. Georgi Hagi made an appearance in these finals for Romania. In some of the other groups, we had a lot of close, dramatic action, which it all came down to final occasions in some cases. And Portugal only scraped through with a a late disputed penalty against the Soviet Union. So there's a strong Soviet Union team. They'd have been likely to have come out of that group, but equally so, Poland were in the same group. They were the seeded team. They had the likes of Boniek, of course, who was one of the top players in Europe at the time for Juventus. But it was Portugal who qualified for their first tournament since the 1966 World Cup. And as the book goes on to tell, in a rather chaotic manner behind the scenes. And yet they're the ones who made it through against these others. England lost out, of course, to Denmark. Again, the emergence of an incredible generation of players for Denmark, and we all celebrated them at the '86 World Cup. But had we been more aware of them at this time, we might have celebrated them in this country sooner. I think in England's case, the old attitudes of thinking, well, Denmark are a kind of team we ought to be beating easily, was still the main perception in the media. Certainly, I think Bobby Robson was a little more enlightened, but not that he could do much about it at times. But in fact, had England not failed to beat a disappointing Greece at home, if they hadn't drawn 0-0 with Greece, then no matter any of the performances they put in against Denmark, they got a very fortunate draw away at the start of the group, and then they lost at Wembley to Denmark. Despite all of that, if England had managed to beat Greece, they would have qualified anyway. So the failings were not just on one occasion for England there. That's, of course, the first campaign for Bobby Robson as well. More drama elsewhere, mind you, so involving other British teams, not Scotland. They were truly atrocious, so we'll move on past them. But Wales, what a story of woe this is for Wales. Not as widely known or celebrated, perhaps. Not celebrated is the wrong word. Remembered as the '78 World Cup calamity and then the '86 World Cup near miss and so on, I guess because of the nature of it being a World Cup. But in this one, they on more than one occasion came within moments of qualifying, and ultimately at the end were within a few seconds of qualifying. They'd had the chance to seal qualification at home to Yugoslavia in their final game, but they ended up drawing 1-1. And that meant a week later, the expected outcome when Yugoslavia faced Bulgaria in their final game. And the expected victory for the Yugoslavs would have seen them qualify ahead of Wales. They still had an outside chance, however. They'd been within, 10 or so minutes of qualifying on that occasion at home. But it was gone and they assumed it was all done for. But if Yugoslavia and Bulgaria drew, Wales could still qualify. Equally, Bulgaria could qualify if they won. So it was a bit of a three-way shootout with only two teams on the field. And as it was, both Yugoslavia and Bulgaria had it in their hands at various times. But in the closing seconds, it was all square in this game in Split, I think it was. So Wales were still through somehow. Then Bulgaria broke up the field, had a 3-on-1 break and contrived to screw it up. This is all in stoppage time on the 90th minute. They managed to screw it up. So they should have qualified then and there, but they didn't. They failed. And Wales are still in. And the clock has gone past the 90 now, and the time is just about up. But the ball goes up the other end, and Yugoslavia score, and the whole place goes into absolute pandemonium. So in the space of about a minute, Bulgaria should have qualified. Wales were back in, and then Yugoslavia did qualify. That's painful. And again, that Welsh generation was a lot of famous names coming through at this point. It was still early days for the likes of Ian Rush, Mark Hughes, and there was obviously Kevin Ratcliffe, Neville Southall, and so on. But there was a strong generation, and they came so close. More British misfortune, or UK misfortune, came with Northern Ireland, who twice beat West Germany in their group and yet still didn't qualify. Again, it's failings against other teams that ultimately cost them, Turkey and Albania being the thorns in their side. And Albania, that would be a good one for you, Phil. They nearly handed it back to Northern Ireland by making it difficult for West Germany at the end of the group, but ultimately the Germans found a way through. But the final big story, I guess, is Spain. They went into their final game with Malta, needing to win by 11 goals to qualify. Now, the Netherlands had played Malta a few days before, and had beaten them 5-0, which is what left Spain needing this margin. I'm sure the Dutch could have rattled in a few more if they'd really felt inclined, but surely when you pushed it to a point where where Spain need 11 goals, you think you're going to be okay. But famously, this game did end 12-1, so Spain got their 11 goals, but it's given rise to all sorts of conspiracy theories and the like. So I'm inclined to think that the Maltese were absolutely exhausted from having taken on these two big teams in short succession, and various issues of logistic problems they had when they traveled to Spain. But equally, you can see why it's given rise to such theories. However, Spain did miss an early penalty, and then midway through the first half, Malta had equalised, and it was 1-1. So ultimately, it was all a big sudden race of goals in the second half that saw them through. But quite astonishing. And that's one I do remember seeing on Football Focus or Sports Night or something back in December 1983, and just thinking what an incredible thing is going on. Or probably just thought, oh, Malta are useless. That's probably what I thought at the time. But again, that Dutch was the beginning of the strong generation that would go on and be champions 4 years later. There was a couple of people left over from the 70s team, but not many. It was mostly the newcomers starting to come through. So I think that's in part what the story is a lot of closely fought, close groups, really tight battles, but there's the emergence of new powers. That's what ultimately led to this tournament and brought in new blood to the team rather than just the same old. And I think the format where there was just 8 qualifiers and you had to win your group kind of lent itself to that. Qualification was a struggle. It was a real struggle, and you had to really earn your place.
Yeah, so and we end up with this roster of unusual kind of bedfellows for the tournament. Teams, as you say, that we weren't really expecting to be there, but they were there. And I had a look at. I asked you to earmark some of the players that were tipped to be stars of 1984, because I looked at the squad. There were some great players in there. I mean, Embo Shifo, he was in virtually in his infancy of football. He was there, and Michael Laudrup appeared in his first tournament, only 19, but he was already treading the turf at the Stadio Olimpico. And these were just new talents. And George Hadji, you mentioned, and these were new talents coming through. But
Dragan Stojkovic is another one you could add, just emerging.
Of course, yeah. He scored, didn't he, in the tournament? He scored against France, yeah. But who were the kind of recognised stars going into the tournament? Because there was some powerful squads. And I would hazard to say that the two favourite teams were probably West Germany and France going in, weren't they? Because
that would be the expectation at that point. But there was a lot of talk of Denmark as well. Now, that may not have been the way that many people in this country understood Denmark's place to be. But as you talked there about Laudrup and obviously Preben Elkjær, who was slightly older than him and was a little more established, but equally the likes of Alan Simonsen and Morten Olsen further back, the quality that they had. Simonsen being a former European Footballer of the Year, of course. Morten Olsen with Anderlecht at the time. Frank Arnesen also. There were a lot of players in the top echelons of European football. So they were highly rated too. But in terms of most expectations, yes, France and West Germany were the expected two finalists. Rummenigge being West Germany's star at this point in time, but they had issues with their coach. He wasn't particularly popular, Joop Derval. Into a World Cup final, but there'd been all sorts of arguments and issues behind the scenes, claims of favoritism towards Rummenigge. Their other world-class player really was the goalkeeper, Harold Schumacher, or Tony as he's called sometimes. But of course, he was coming into the bear pit of France, having tried to decapitate a Frenchman in the World Cup semi-final only 2 years ago. So he wasn't popular in France. So that might have always had a bit of an issue for them. But for France, they were the favourites, which seems obvious now with hindsight. But looking back, France didn't have much of a track record of international football. success. Well, no success, and not much of a track record of performing well. But this generation and what they'd done in 1982, their emergence in 1978 at that World Cup that you mentioned earlier, the Platini, Giresse generation, really, they're the ones who've been with it throughout. But you've now got the likes of Tigana and others coming into the mix just to take it up to another level, another notch. How well they'd done in 1982 had obviously grabbed much attention, and that had led them to being seen equally as favourites. But a lot of this will have been because of Michel Platini. He was in the midst of winning the European Player of the Year 3 years in a row at this point. He was starring with Juventus week in, week out. He was, I think, for this particular window in time, the best player in the world. I think there's a brief period between probably the latter stages of Zico's preeminence and then Diego Maradona ascending the greatest heights that he did. However, at this particular moment this year, I would say Michel Platini was the best player in the world. It all just came so easy to him. And therefore, yes, France were strongly favoured despite their lack of any real football international pedigree, which seems ridiculous when you think of what they are now. And yet that was the case back then.
Yeah, they hadn't quite achieved anything. They come close, but never really looked close to winning a tournament. It was they always fell a little bit short. But funny you should mention Platini, because I actually saw him play in person at Villa Park in the 1982-83 season. Villa v Juventus in the quarterfinals of the European Cup, and he delivered possibly the finest pass that I've ever seen in the flesh, so to speak. And it was the one that kind of laid on Boniek for the winner with about 10 minutes to go. It was just so, I don't know, there's a certain like arrogance to it, all the things that you kind of allude to when you talk about waved his right foot at the to him and delivered this fantastic pass with the outside of his right boot that kind of completely opened up the Villa defence. And Boniek just delivered the killer blow. But he was an absolutely fantastic footballer. But anyway, let's head into the groups, because the groups were amazing. There were some incredible games at the group level. So can you talk us through those groups?
Yeah, it's very split, because one group was absolutely spectacular, and the other was a bit more of the tension variety rather than the spectacular nature, I think. So France's group one, this is where a lot of the goals and a lot of the attention definitely goes. They were in with Denmark, Belgium, and Yugoslavia. And obviously we've talked about Denmark and their strength at this point. Now, this was the opening game of the tournament, was France-Denmark. Now, France at this point, no, they won it, and Platini scored, but it was quite late on. It took a slight deflection on its way in. You know, Denmark had largely held France, and the French had struggled to fully get their rhythm at this stage. That would come in due course, I think. Opening day nerves and so on, and just settling into the tournament was in part of that. Equally, Denmark were playing in a more pragmatic way than they were capable of on this occasion, just seeking to hold the French, I think, and keep themselves in the tournament. They wanted it to, didn't want to get blown away, and equally didn't want to cut too loose themselves and leave themselves too exposed. So I think that was a lot of the case there. But the goals in this group as it went on just simply became more extraordinary by the moment. And Belgium and Yugoslavia had their moments as well, even though Yugoslavia ultimately lost all 3 games. And yet when they actually went forwards, they showed they were quite capable of a fair bit as well. It's the second round of group games in this one, though, really stand out, because there were 2 5-0 victories on the same day. Firstly, France beat Belgium 5-0. This is Belgium who'd just beaten Yugoslavia in the opening game. But as Schifo pointed out on that, he wasn't sure whether it was that they were any good or whether Yugoslavia were terrible. And I think this answered that to some extent. Highly notable for the fact that Platini scored again. He scored a hat-trick, and it was a perfect hat-trick. Right foot, left foot, and a header. He then repeated that trick a few days later against Yugoslavia. Right foot, left foot, header. But we'll come to that. Later that same day as the France 5-0 win, Denmark beat Yugoslavia 5-0. Now, again, this seems like one team vastly outclassing the other. And on the scoreline they did, but Yugoslavia had a lot of the play themselves, had so many chances to score also. This game could have finished anything, maybe 7-8-3 would have been, something like that would have been more appropriate for how the action had played out. But again, you now seem to have your two favourites, though. The dominance of the scoreline and some of the style that they've both shown made them stick out now as the class acts. But this took us into the final games with France now top of the group and Denmark and Belgium, 1 win each, facing a bit of a shootout to qualify. Now, France made heavy weather of getting past Yugoslavia. They did beat them 3-2. Like I say, another Platini hat-trick. He's now on 7 goals from 3 games, for anyone counting. But then the other game, Belgium, needed to beat Denmark in order to progress based on the goal difference. They managed to get themselves 2-0 up, however, and this was a bit of a shock. Now, I know we mentioned Belgium were runners-up in 1980, and they'd obviously been in the World Cup 2 years before, as Denmark had done no such thing. But Belgium came into this tournament off the back of a betting scandal, or a match-fixing scandal, sorry, I should say, in Belgian football, which had actually happened a year or two earlier, but it only came to light earlier in 1984 and resulted in bans for several of the players involved. Notably, the key men of their defence were all missing. So Eric Gerrits, obviously a well-known player, a couple of others, Walter Mews was another key member of their defence that was missing. So they basically came into this tournament with untried, untested, and inadequate defenders, really. And yet they came within a whisker of qualifying for the semi-finals because they were 2-0 up against Denmark. And the Danes managed to fight their way back, and Elkjær scored an absolutely astonishingly good winner 5 minutes from time to take Denmark through the semi-final. He sort of bundled his way past several players who really ought to have stopped him. But he was such a force of nature, highly skilled, but equally very direct, whereas Laudrup was a little more refined and elegant, but they sort of dovetailed perfectly together. But he sort of burst his way through and dinked it over Jean-Marie Fach in the Belgian goal, and Denmark were through to the semi-finals. But the number of goals, the sheer level of quality football, and the absolute drama in this group was incredible. And the fact that Platini, like I say, scored 7 goals in these 3 games was simply astonishing. We'll come on more to the French, I guess, in due course, but his performance already was standing out as something for the ages. The other group was rather lower scoring, shall we say. We've got West Germany, Portugal, Romania, and Spain in this group. Now, first round of fixtures were all drawn. Then Portugal and Spain drew their next game with each other as well, with West Germany edging out Romania thanks to Rudi Voller. He was another one coming onto the scene that would go on to great things in due course. But this was a little more staid. Portugal were a talented team who were playing within themselves, trying to sort of restrict rather than push on. Romania were hugely talented, but again, they played with the shackles on a little bit at times. And despite they'd drawn with Spain and they pushed West Germany close, but it seemed like their chances had come and gone. But they weren't quite out yet. And Spain were very much in the era of the Furia Roja. They weren't tiki-taka by any stretch of the imagination. They were headless chickens running around in a big fury, trying to beat people with their intensity rather than their intricate skills. That's what Spain was in these days. And they were coming into this off the back of an embarrassing World Cup at home, of course. But going to the final group, any of the final games, any of the 4 could still make it through. West Germany were the most expected because they were the only team who'd won a game so far. So really, they just needed a draw to see them through. They were against Spain. And in the other game, Portugal and Romania were effectively a shootout for what was expected to be the other place. Portugal did get their winner against Romania, but they left it late. So that saw them through. And you've got to recall, again, this isn't Portugal that's the strong team we may see today. This was a team who hadn't been in a tournament for 16 years. That tournament in 66 was their only tournament ever. However, they did reach the semi-finals there, and they were set to do so again now. The other game, West Germany-Spain, was the only game so far to have been televised live in the UK. It was dramatic towards the end, and there was some good football in this one. It's got a good game, actually, but it was only one goal. And the fact that it came in the 90th minute and went to Spain was something of a big shock, given the strength of West Germany. And this goal from Antonio Maceda sent Spain through at the top of the group, and therefore avoiding France as well, and sent Portugal off to a date with the French in Marseille in the semi-final. So this was a group not quite of the same endless goal-scoring drama of the first group, but it was knife-edge tension, I guess, and dramatic conclusions that weren't what we might have expected beforehand.
Yeah, but it had its moments of quality. Antonio Sousa's opener against Spain was a beautiful, beautiful finish, and there was obviously Shestik's goal against France, which was oh no, sorry, in the other group. Then there was Nene's volleyed winner that took them through to the semi-final. But then we reached the semi-final, and it seemed like two kind of mismatched games. You had the flair of the French and the flair of the Danes against the kind of hard-nosed pragmatism of the Portuguese and the Spanish. But neither game really turned out like that, did it? Do you want to? I won't give too much away. You tell us about those semi-finals. They were incredible games, both of them.
They were both absolutely spectacular, incredible games. So the first one was France-Portugal. Now this is, I think, the most famous game of the tournament. This is the one that was the sort of window into this tournament for me in years since. This is the one where we have the famous John Motson commentary in the final moments and the crackly sound and beautiful imagery. But this was supposed to be a fairly easy ride for the French. Portugal, okay, they had some talent, especially Fernando Chalana, their winger. But he had been injured in their previous group game, and so was coming into this with a slight question mark. It hadn't been certain to play, but he did. They were also coming into it of, well, this whole tournament had been one of chaos behind the scenes for Portugal, of a rift between the Benfica camp and the Porto camp. And even on the coaching side of things, there was a coaching collective with representation from Benfica and Porto and Sporting. And then there's one other guy trying to sort of hold the peace between a lot of them. And they got to this stage in spite of it all rather than because of it all. But they did have talent. And in this game, they showed a little bit of that, but they only did it in patches. But they really, really made it count in those moments when they did. But it got off to a perfect start for the French. Birthday boy, Jean-François Domergue, who was a fullback, had only come into the team. Well, he was a backup player in the squad, really, but he only come into the starting team because Manuel Amoros had got himself sent off in the opener against Denmark for headbutting Jesper Olsen. He did say that he headbutted him because he got so angry, having already thrown the ball at Jesper Olsen and missed, that it really, really annoyed him. So he felt like headbutting him. And then subsequently he was banned. He was only available again for the final. So Jean-François Domergue scored from a free kick in the first half of this semi-final. It took everyone by surprise because Platini pretty much took every free kick for France. He himself viewed a free kick as being just a good opportunity to him as a penalty because he scored from them so often. And yet on this occasion, Jean-François Domergue took it and scored. And even the TV images flashed up, said 10 Platini, because they'd obviously had that ready and they pushed that button and they had to rapidly change it and put up Domergue's name against that goal. It shocked everybody. But the France had scored midway through the first half. The first half had been a little more bitty. This is in the glorious venue of the old Velodrome in Marseille. It was a little more ramshackle than its modern equivalent. The stands were a little more haphazard. There was odd little bits jutting out here and there, but it was beautiful in the way that only something a bit crumbly can be. And it was in late evening sunshine. It was a 8 p.m. kickoff, and the sort of long shadows and the sort of beautiful golden light that time of day gives it all. It really added to the mix, certainly in the first half, and as the game wore on, that obviously got slightly darker until we get to the main moments later on. But the second half, France just cut loose. They were sublime. They were pouring forward, chance after chance after chance. And the unlikely character of Manuel Bento in Portugal's goal. Now, he was a good-ish goalkeeper, and I say ish because he was probably from the Grobbelaar school of consistency, if you like. You know, he was capable of excellence, but equally capable of the stupid and the crazy. And speaking of Liverpool, it's Liverpool fans who probably remember him from this particular season as well, playing for Benfica against Liverpool and having a slightly chaotic day and not doing very well. And yet here he was, turning away chances from Platini, from Luis Fernandez, from Jean Tigana, from Gires, from Platini again and again and again. It was just endless, and he was just having the day of his life. And yet the play was all coming in one direction, except for a sort of 5 or 10 minute spell late in this second half. And like I say, Portugal had their moments, and when they went for it, they really went for it, and they got their success through. Initially, it was a header from Rui Jordão, who was the sole Sporting Club representative in this lineup. He was isolated in so many respects, like the Benfica faction all ate their dinner on one table, the Porto players ate their dinner on another, and he was all on his own. And he was a bit like that on the field as well, because he was their striker who was just left way up front on his own most of the time without anyone else near him. But he got their equaliser, went off and did an iconic little jig in the corner, and it was 1-1. Now, this is France in a semi-final, heading into extra time. They had demons when it came to this. They had real dark demons. Seville in 1982 was very, very fresh, and what had happened to them in extra time against West Germany. They'd already lost Battiston by that stage, the Schumacher assault. So there's that sense of injustice. Then they went 3-1 up, and yet contrived to concede twice and then lose on penalties to West Germany on that occasion. Now they're heading into another semi-final that they're expected to win, and we're heading into extra time, again. And is it all going to go wrong? Those doubts just kept coming and coming. Into extra time, the French continued to play the way they did. They kept attacking and attacking, but into the second half of extra time, only a couple of minutes in there, Rui Jordão again scores to give Portugal the lead. Now, it was a slightly scuffed volley that went down into the ground and then bounced up over the keeper and in. But again, he goes off and does his little jig in the corner, and incredibly, it's Portugal now on the verge of the final against this French team. Absolutely astonishing at that time. But Alain Giresse got a quote from him in the aftermath, and what he was thinking at the time was that, well, we were the best. We knew what to do. We didn't panic. We just reset the machine and went again. And they just kept going and going and going. But there were only 10 minutes left at the time Jordão scored. And they only equalized with 5 or 6 minutes left. And it was Jean-Francois Domergue again. He's the birthday boy on this occasion, and what a birthday he had. They may well have been about to get a penalty for Platini getting felled, but the ball, in a goal-mouth scramble, fell to Domergue, who prodded it in, and suddenly they were level again. Now all the momentum is pouring forward, but again, those demons. This is 2-2. We're only a couple of minutes left in extra time. Are the French going to have to go through a semi-final penalty shootout again? Now, we English may think we've got demons, but they, at this point, it was the same players that had just lived through that nightmare 2 years before, and it was all coming back. Platini afterwards joked that Tigana had said to them all that he'd never ever won a penalty shootout, so they knew they had to get it done before the end of the game. And the goal that won it is one of the iconic moments of European Championship history, of international football history. And John Motson's commentary goes perfectly with it, even though essentially he just repeats names and says them again and again and again. Now, Jean Tigana, he was excellent. He was another birthday boy on this occasion. He was magnificent. Oh, he's a superb, stylish player. And it was his driving run that sort of led to this chance. As John Motson said, Tigana, 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 and eventually he crossed the ball, and it was from such a narrow angle that Bento had sort of dived after the cross, trying to reach it. A couple of defenders were sliding all over the place, trying to block it and the shot that was about to come, and it fell to Platini, of course, who the one game so far that he hadn't scored in. So here's his moment, 1 minute from the end of extra time. And of course, he smashes it into the net. And the whole place goes crazy as Motson finishes his exclamation with Platini, goal! And his voice just goes so high-pitched and crackly. It's gloriously beautiful.
Yeah.
So that was that victory. It was just incredible. I mean, the lateness of the winner just adds to it all. And I think this has gone down as an absolute classic, but I think it's from the second half onwards it really earns that reputation. But astonishing game of football. But that was just part one, of course. Another semi-final to go.
It was. It's really the Jean-Francois Demergue. It's serendipitous, really, because the only 2 goals he scored for France were in a semi-final of a major competition, and another French defender, Lilian Thuram. The only 2 goals that he ever scored were in the semi-final of a major tournament.
It's incredible.
Yeah, you
it
can't
is
believe
incredible.
it.
Yeah. The fullbacks union, they're what you need for France to win a tournament in the semi-final stage. Definitely, it's incredible.
They love a fullback in France, don't they? But moving on, we've covered part 1, but part 2 to an extent had all of the kind of residual drama of the first semi-final, didn't it? It was an incredible game too.
It was, yeah, absolutely magnificent game. And now Denmark against Spain, we've got our clear favourite again here. Now France were expected to comfortably beat Portugal, and likewise Denmark were expected to comfortably beat Spain. And it seemed that it was all going to plan when they took the lead after 7 minutes. It just seemed that that's what was expected now, and they would run away with it, show their dominance, and push on from there. The goal from Soren Lerby was, it came in part from the excellence of others, as you'd expect from this terrific team. But it was another sort of push towards what was the expected outcome. They really should have just made it through from there. That seemed how it was all set up, and that seemed, when you look at their celebration and the celebration of their fans as well, it all just seemed like, yep, that's done. It's exactly as we expect. We know what to do from here now. But it didn't quite work out that way. I guess we should mention the Danish fans as well. This was their huge following that they took with them, and among their number this day was a young Peter Schmeichel. So that's a nice little link to the team that would win 8 years later, of course. But this Spain were, if anything, they were dogged, and they never gave up. Now, obviously, I've talked about how they qualified initially and the remarkable circumstances around that. Then they've had the incredible qualification from this first round group with the last gasp winner against West Germany. So they're used to defying the odds by this point. And it was Antonio Maceda again who scored midway through the second half. He'd scored the winner against West Germany, and he scored again here to make it 1-1. Now, again, Denmark's dominance, their ability, they should have still been able to see this through in the remainder of normal time or extra time, but they didn't, and it went to penalties. And even in the penalty shootout, there's some sort of remarkable moments. So we'd had penalties retaken, having been missed. Laudrup for Denmark in that case. We'd had players walking up with their tracksuit tops on, not realizing it and being told to take them off, which was the case for Sarabia for Spain. But the most unfortunate person was Preben Elkjær. Now, he was the real star of this tournament for Denmark. And yet, sadly, he's the one who ultimately missed. I mean, we had some spectacular penalties in the top corner as well. Soren Lerby, who'd scored earlier in the game, he'd lashed one in. And Spanish, was it Senora Victor had done likewise as well. I can't remember which one. But it came to this final moment. And Preben Elkjær, he'd already got his shorts ripped in this game, so unfortunately his moment of misery had to be had to see him walking away with his pants on view. But he sort of changed his mind at the last moment, because I think he'd seen Arconada going the right way, and he tried to adjust and push it further into the corner, but ultimately he adjusted too much and missed altogether. It's such a shame for a player that had been one of the real stars of the tournament. You know, a notch below Platini, sure, but he was the other prime star of this tournament. It's a terrible shame that he was the one who missed out, because ultimately, you know, we talk about the great team of 1986 and how spellbinding they were at times, but they didn't quite get as close to the latter stages of the tournament as this one. And really, this is a tournament that they could have won. It got away from them in the end. But now Spain are in the final, remarkably, after all the points where they could have dropped out, they could have gone, and yet here they are. It's Spain against France in the final. But you know, the expected outcome there was pretty clear to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, Spain had that backbone of the 1982 team, didn't they? There was Camacho was in there, Tendillo. There's other kind of defensive stalwarts. Santillana was still playing, but they, as you say, they weren't a pretty team. Miguel Munoz had sort of somehow summoned the as you say, the most dogged performances out of them, and here they were in the final against a Platini-led France, who was unarguably the player of the tournament. He went on to prove to be a dreadful administrator, but he was a fantastic footballer, as we've discussed before. And in a final that didn't quite live up to its billing, Platini was still able to leave a significant imprint on it, wasn't he? Do you want to talk us through that final? Because it wasn't a great game.
It wasn't. No, and this is in part why it feels so annoying from our perspective, because again, this was the other game that was live on TV, and like I mentioned earlier, this is the one I got to watch. And you know, it as a game, it doesn't stick long in the memory. It was poor, and Spain had as many chances as France did. I don't know whether they were overcome with nerves, the French. They just couldn't quite hit the same rhythm that they'd been on in all these preceding games and cut loose so magnificently. But yes, Platini was still central to it all and still had the defining iconic moment. And yet it was rather fortunate when it came. Now, Luis Arconada, he was the Spanish goalkeeper. He was a very, very good goalkeeper, but his most high-profile moments have, unfortunately for him, been disappointments. So he was the goalkeeper when they played Northern Ireland in the World Cup 2 years earlier, who'd handed the ball on a plate, really, to Jerry Armstrong for that famous winner. He had been superb in the semi-final against Denmark. Absolutely superb. We talked about Bento in the other semi-final. And that was slightly unexpected, I guess, in a more erratic way. Luis Arconada wasn't particularly erratic. He was just excellent, and he was superb in that game. And one of the main reasons why Spain had got this far. And yet here he is on the biggest match of his international career, of his career in total, and he makes the biggest of howlers, unfortunately. It was a Platini free kick. This is in the second half. Both teams had chances to go in front, Spain themselves as well by now. But a Platini free kick from the edge of the box. Now, I mentioned how the usual outcome from this is, but this was one free kick he didn't hit particularly well. It was low, it was towards the corner, but easily covered by Arcanada, and yet he let it squirm under his body. And there's a glorious picture, which is so painful to look at, that shows the ball just squirting away from him as his body fell on the ball. His pressure and the force of his body pushed the ball towards the line, and his arms just reaching for it, and you know he can't get there, and the ball's gone, and you can see a Spanish defender with his head in his hands and a French attacker with his arms raised in triumph, and you just feel for him in that moment. Awful, but that's how France took the lead. Platini himself, he's now scored in every game in this tournament. He scored 9 goals in 5 games. Absolutely astonishing. And yet this one, he wasn't proud of his goal in any way, shape, or form. He felt awful for Arcanada. He would have rather, of course, he celebrated it. Who wouldn't? But he, with hindsight, really, really wished he'd beaten him with a good goal rather than in this way. But what can you do? And this was France desperate for a victory. They sealed it with a beautiful goal, however, from Bruno Bellon, lifting it over Arcanada in the final minutes. But this was a point where Spain were pushing everything forwards, looking for another late reprieve, which didn't come. Ultimately, it was the right winner, very much so. Nobody could argue that, but it was a bit of a strange way it came about, given everything that had gone before. But Platini's achievement and the goals he got, it's, to my mind, the greatest tournament performance there's ever been. And I know people will cite Maradona in '86, but I don't think he was as individually dominant and as individually central to everything in quite the same way that Platini was. He I don't want to understate Maradona, because he was very central to a lot that happened in that team, but I think Platini took it to a different level beyond that.
I think you're right. And 1986 wasn't as good a tournament as France '84. It just didn't have the quality. It didn't have the great game, the number of great games, and it didn't. Well, there was a lot of good goals in '86, but the overall quality of play throughout the piece wasn't quite as good. And now we talk about legacy of tournaments, but 1984 Euros did have its legacy, bearing in mind what had gone before. So do you want to talk us through the legacy of
I think there's multiple legacies. For the tournament itself, I think it was a tournament reborn almost, or you could almost see this as its founding moment, really, as a proper tournament in wider consciousness, but as in something that was of the caliber to be able to compete with the World Cup. It was still a smaller thing, but its level of importance was now much more. I don't think we in this country fully cottoned onto that for a few more years yet. I think 1988 with England and Ireland obviously captured more attention here, and probably was the first European Championship of real domestic importance because of that. But '84 is what made the European Championships become a far more significant deal, if not quite on par with the World Cup, at least getting close to it. And in terms of overall quality across the board, it was surpassed what a World Cup could ever be. And it surpassed what a European Championship will ever be again, given the level of expansion. I think it also pushed it into modern times, like I mentioned earlier. So the whole marketing was brand new. All the TV deals that went alongside it. UK had their own TV deals. They just opted not to bother showing it. It was a much more coordinated effort. The whole ticketing was a lot more organized. The travel for away fans was much more than it had been at prior tournaments. The atmosphere around it just seemed more like an actual tournament, how we'd think of one today. That's not to say it was fully embraced throughout by the French, because they were a skeptical bunch at the best of times. And this was a time where football was only really emerging to become truly loved in France. This generation is what caused that. But this is a time where cycling was probably the biggest deal. We've got, for any cycling enthusiasts, this is the time of Bernard Hinault and Laurent Fignon dominating the Tour de France. These were the superstars of French sport. Rugby was also bigger in many ways. the emergence of Saint Etienne through the 70s and the strength that came from other of the club sides were changing that picture. But it was only really the sort of the sporting tragedy of 82 and the glory of 84 that actually caused French football to become a primary thing for them. So there's another legacy of it. But in terms of the tournament itself, it made it a modern tournament, and it made it a tournament on a similar standing to a World Cup, and to be the first time really viewed at that level. I think in terms of France as well, this French team, their legacy, like I mentioned at the start, is the rarity of being the beautiful team that actually won. We'd had the likes of the Dutch in the 70s, we'd had the Brazil 82 team, there'd been various others through the years. And we go back to Hungary, the best team, they don't always win. Brazil 70, they did, but that is one of only a few where you could really claim the best team had won. In European Championships, you could cite West Germany 72 as another equivalent. But the past two tournaments have been disappointing from that regard. But here was a idealist team playing in the style and character of the French people, that slightly languid, lazy swagger, confident, elegant, beautiful, all of these things rolled into one. As Platini said, a football team represents a way of being and a culture, and he exemplified that more than anyone. And he was in sync with his coach, Michel Hidalgo, in that regard as well. They were a perfect match. And I think the whole sort of casual elegance, the appreciation of artistic beauty, all of this is what made this team so great. So it secured their legacy and Platini's footballing playing legacy. As you mentioned, he spoiled that with what came in terms of the overall, but I don't think anything can take away from Platini, the player. He was, for all the French success that's come since, and for all the likes of Zidane, Mbappe, and whoever else you want to cite from their modern generations of huge numbers of excellent players, I don't see that any of them hold a candle to Platini as a player, despite it all. And equally, the other legacy of this era, and in fact of French football in general, the whole 1998 World Cup was seen as a big success for multiculturalism, the whole Black Blanc Beurre narrative of the mix of the melting pot of cultures. But so was this team, and in fact, so had been many of the French predecessors. You had people in this side who were the children of immigrants, just as had been the case in 98 and just had been the case in preceding teams as well. So again, that legacy became more mainstream later on, but that was already there for those willing to see it at this point. But I think, the legacy is, there's so many layers to it. And this team as well became loved in France beyond any other. They won a European Championship and no World Cup, and yet they are loved far more than the 98 and 2000 team and the 2018 and current team. It's that's their best legacy, because they were the most beautiful.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think they were the best version of a French national team, weren't they? And you can't. I would not argue with that at all. 1998, great players, bit functional for my liking, and the same again with Pogba and Mbappe, powerful but not beautiful.
Yeah,
and I think that's the difference, isn't it? Aidan, thanks for coming on. It's been great talking to you. Do you have any upcoming projects that you're working on at the moment, mate?
Well, mainly at the moment it's the magazine focus with These Football Times and the podcast and so on. I'm mulling over other book ideas. I haven't got anything committed yet. I've got one or two ideas that may come to fruition, but we'll have to see on that front. But I definitely want to do more. So yeah, I just need to decide.
Right, you find yourself in that quandary when you're writing a book that another idea comes into mind. You just want to get that one finished so you can move on to the next one.
Exactly. I've got the ideas. I just need to think them through.
Oh, good, mate. And it's a fantastic book. As I say, it does it transports you to that summer of 1984 and that fantastic tournament. Where can people get their hands on Euro 1984?
Every good online bookseller. So Amazon, of course, have got it, but so do Waterstones and WH Smith's and the Pitch Publishing website. But yes, all the usual places, and hopefully a few physical bookshops as well. That would be nice to see. But yes, and it's out late April, and but it is all available for pre-order as we speak.
That's right, good. And you can't beat a bookshop, guys. Go out there and support your local bookshop. Go and buy the book off the shelf from a bookshop.
Absolutely.
Please do that. Aidan, thank you for being a wonderful guest. It's been fantastic. And join us next time on Football Geeks for more informed chat and banter. Till then, bye, guys.